Byron Champlin, a member of the Lincoln Financial team, and also a member of the political scene here in Concord, New Hampshire. And Miss Erin McNabb, whose credentials aren't quite as impressive, but
oh, more so, please.
Erin is young, charming, and she works here. And she was asked to volunteer an opinion about a movie that she has never seen before. And just to see just exactly how someone who is 20 years of age in the year 2017 reacts to something that's 50 years old about a 20-year-old guy, even though Brother Hoffman was probably 29 when this was made. He was young looking for his age. The only other thing that I'd like to mention before I shut up and let them say something is that a guy by the name of Charles Webb is responsible for the writing of this story. It was first published in 1963, and it was written by Webb shortly after he graduated from Williams College. And according to what I read, having not read Mr. Webb's book, the film follows the storyline in the book very closely. Erin, I'm going to ask you, and get the elephant in the room out of the way. What did you think of this? Does this have any? How are you affected by what you saw here? Is there any connection between somebody 50 years ago who was 20 and yourself or anyone you might know at the present time that might be going through some sort of, what's life all about, and what am I supposed to be doing, and what direction should I be heading?
Okay, I think after watching it, I think anyone who has watched the movie can resonate with the character Ben with uncertainty at any point in life, but especially after going through like the societal norms of going through high school, going through college, and being the best at whatever, and then after that there's that drop-off period where you're like, what should I do? And I also think that during times of where everything's hectic and things, people do things that aren't as rational. So I also resonated in that way in doing some things, not to that extent of having an affair or anything like that, but I definitely resonated with Ben.
So you found it believable as far as his
motives.
Motives, and maybe it was a little radical how he handled the situation, but that's part of the human condition. Sometimes you find yourself doing things that you might look back on and say, I should have done it differently, maybe. But I think a lot of people, after this is over, they think of that final scene in the movie. Here he has disrupted the church service. He has definitely attracted the attention of the girl again, and she's decided that, I think I'm going to go with Benjamin rather than Carl. And when they leave the church, there's big smiles on their faces. They get on the bus, they get in the back of the bus, and the bus takes off, and all of a sudden the smiles come back momentarily, but then they disappear. And I guess there's always been a question in the viewer's mind as to what's going to become of these people. You got any thoughts on that, Mr. Champlin?
Well, actually, I went, as usual when you ask me to do these things, I do a little bit of research. And here's what, at the 30th anniversary of The Graduate, and this was not a setup, but thank you, this is what Roger Ebert said. He said, is The Graduate a bad movie? Not at all. Is it a good topical? It is a good topical movie whose time has passed, leaving it stranded in an earlier age. I give it 3 stars out of delight for the material it contains. To watch it today is like opening a time capsule. To know that the movie once spoke strongly to a generation is to understand how deep the generation gap ran during that extraordinary time in the late 1960s. There were true rebels in movies of the period, see Easy Rider, but Benjamin Braddock was not one of them. I wonder how long it took him to get into plastics. Ebert's contention is that Benjamin probably should have taken the advice, and probably did, and probably at the end of, after the film closes, goes off to lead a fairly boring life as an attorney or as some corporate hack. I don't know that that's true. And I understand what he says about there being other rebels. Certainly, you could say that Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper were greater rebels, but on the other hand, they were basically, drug dealers who got shot down on a road in Louisiana. And as Peter Fonda said at the time to Dennis, as Captain America says to Billy, we blew it. So how we gauge rebellious characters and how we look at these eras in the past, I think can vary based on our lens. I think it's interesting that Erin, finds it something that she can relate to, because I certainly related to it when I first saw it, and on reviewing it this time, it still resonated for me. But I wonder, I'll ask a question of the audience, a couple questions, because this is what I do. Like, how many people have seen this before tonight? So almost everybody. How many people found Mrs. Robinson a sympathetic character? Yeah. Why? Why did you find her a sympathetic character?
She had a sadness to her that is below the surface, and an anger that she couldn't be with herself, and she couldn't be happy for her daughter. Although I found it interesting that the only time she seemed to be happy was that moment when he was banging on the window, and she turned to the husband and said, "It's too late."
Yeah.
It was almost as if that's what she wanted.
And there's also sort of a wistful happiness to her when they're in the bedroom and in the hotel room, he's trying to get her to talk. And she kind of starts, her face, she's turned towards the camera and away from him, and you see a little glimmer go across her face of remembering a time when there were possibilities. And I think that part of the reason that works is because her possibilities have really significantly diminished, and he's a guy who's trying to figure out what his possibilities are and where he's going to go. Anybody else who found her a sympathetic character? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I found that she had bought into the period and realized that she had sacrificed herself and her own life in terms of buying into the times.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I think both of those are really, really good observations. Anne Bancroft is certainly an outstanding actress, and I think that she fully submerged herself in this role, and she really was Mrs. Robinson. And for many people, I think that's who Anne Bancroft was. Ironically, there really was only a few years difference between her.
Six,
Yeah, between
actually,
five.
between their ages.
6? Yes, 6. You're
6
right.
years.
She was 35.
Yep.
Yeah. There's a great story, and I'll give this up because I don't want to Bogart hit another film illusion, and another 60s illusion too. There's a great story that Mel Brooks tells about this. I saw an interview with Dustin Hoffman talking about The Graduate, and he did not mention this at all, but I once heard Mel Brooks tell the story. Of course, Mel Brooks is Mr. Anne Bancroft, and Mel Brooks was in pre-production, for a little film called The Producers. And one night he and Anne Bancroft are in their Greenwich Village home, and he's awoken in the middle of the night, and it's pebbles being thrown, rocks being thrown against his window, according to the way he tells it. And he goes and he opens the window, and Dustin Hoffman is standing down at the bottom of the street. And he says, Mel, he says, I just got a call from my agent. Mike Nichols wants me to fly out to the West Coast to do a screen test for a film. And so Mel Brooks says, well, I know that the only film that Nichols is working on is The Graduate, because Annie's been cast as Mrs. Robinson. And he said, and the reason that Hoffman is down there is because Brooks has cast him in the producers in the role of the Nazi pigeon keeper who writes Springtime for Hitler. and Hoffman is saying, Mel, you got to let me go take the screen test. And Mel Brooks thinks to himself, well, he'll never get it. He's way too old for the role. So he said, yeah, go ahead. And then when you get back, talk to me. You know, very small community. And the rest is history, because, of course, this is Dustin Hoffman's first film role. And what's the film after this?
No, he had been in a couple of things before this, but
Are you sure?
pretty nondescript stuff.
What was he in?
And there's a little ditty called Madigan's Millions, I think was the name of it.
Well, I never heard of it, so that's why.
They dredged it up after his success in Midnight Cowboy. It was they found an old John Boyd movie too, and they AIP in their illustrious wisdom put the two films together in order to try to lead the public into thinking that they were brand new films, but they weren't.
I stand corrected.
The thing that I thought was kind of funny is that reading about in the interim, Buck Henry, who plays the hotel clerk and who had a sincere hand in adapting Charles Webb's story to what you watched tonight, apparently made the statement that he could foresee a sequel to this. And the sequel would be that indeed the two lovers stayed together happily, and upon Mrs. Robinson having a stroke, took her in and took care of her for the rest of her life. I'm sure Mr. Henry had his tongue thoroughly implanted in his cheek when he said that. Other odd things, I always found it kind of fascinating to hear who was looking to play parts in films and didn't get the job for one reason or another. Robert Redford wanted to play the part of Benjamin, and that was nixed without any hesitation at all by Mike Nichols, who said, you know, who's going to believe that, you know, you are going to be seduced by some woman? I said, you know, you're a beautiful-looking specimen of maleness. This just doesn't work. Sorry, Bob. Bob insisted, but as you know, he didn't get his way. Gene Hackman was originally cast as Mr. Robinson, but was fired from the set because after a few days of being involved with the project, Nichols thought that he was too young for the role, even though he was like physically a year older than Anne Bancroft was, so that would have made him 36 years old. Ava Gardner sought the role of Mrs. Robinson, but was never seriously considered. Mike Nichols initially wanted French actress Jeanne Moreau to play Mrs. Robinson, and that was shot down by Joseph E. Levine, the man who put up the money along with a man by the name of Terman, who was the producer. They didn't like that idea at all. And the only other thing that I could summon up was the fact that Sally Field tested for the part of Elaine, which eventually went to Catherine Ross. I find that in looking back, I remember this as being a huge hit, and some records will give you the idea that it was one of the biggest grossing films in 1967, although it did go into 1968 quite generously. As I said earlier, I remember playing all 4 of the films, and specifically The Graduate at Cinema 93 over on Loudon Road. And one thing that drove me crazy when I was playing the film at that time, and played it for probably a period of 5 or 6 weeks, was the soundtrack by Simon and Garfunkel. I couldn't get away from the music. I would go in and act as the owner-operator of the theater at night, and my proximity to the projection booth was just 2 or 3 steps, and there was no door. The man who was the projectionist always had the monitor on, so the sound was quite audible down in my office. And all I could hear for like 4 hours during the course of every night for 5 or 6 weeks was this music, which started off likably enough, but then I would leave the theater and I would go home and listen to the radio. And what's playing on the stinking radio? But Mrs. Robinson and the rest of the Simon and Garfunkel songs, and I just couldn't escape the music. It was driving me nuts. But the music holds up well, and I think that's an integral part of your enjoyment of this. It was a pretty shrewd decision on somebody's part to utilize their talents in conjunction with this movie. Is there anything that you would like to ask that we probably don't know the answer to, but we might be able to at least talk about it? Yes, ma'am.
I am thinking 50 years ago, I wondered if it was edited originally because they did not show nudity 50 years ago in films, nor did they swear the way they swore in this film. So do you think it was bleeped out or was edited and now we're seeing the original unedited film?
No, this is the movie that was shown in 1967. And honestly, it was about a year or so before this time that the old motion picture code that had been in effect since the mid-30s, which would have precluded that you couldn't see nudity and you couldn't hear language. Part of that code was literally blasted to smithereens by Mike Nichols' version of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf as far as the language was concerned. And the nudity factor as far as film was in 1966 a British film called Blow Up by Michelangelo
Antonioni.
Thank you very much. There was a very vivid scene of 2 young ladies in the nude for this cameraman against a piece of purple paper. And so this just barely missed, or just barely came into being when the motion picture code decided that there should be a rating system, which was instituted late in the year 1967. And I can vouch for the fact that it created havoc at the box office. Because up until that time, there was no restriction really to anyone coming to see a film in a movie theater. And then all of a sudden, there was an R rating and an X rating, which didn't crop up initially. It took a year or two before Hollywood ventured forth and was doing stuff like Medium Cool and Midnight Cowboy, which were originally rated X, by today's standards.